Looks like it's live. Welcome to Teachers Teaching Teachers. We have Puerto Rico in the house tonight. Ada Oken, who is a teacher of a few years, you'll clarify that in a second when you introduce yourself, has been working with the Choices program at Brown University, and we'll learn more about that program. But specifically, recently, Ada developed some curriculum around the Hurricane Maria and the situation in Puerto Rico. And Joe Dillon graciously is joining with us tonight. I was going to say that Ada's kids have, when you were teaching last year, your kids were on Youth Voices, and so you're part of our community already. Now you're doing this other job. It's great to have you back. Joe, do you want to introduce yourself, and then Ada can pick up as well?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Joe Dillon. I'm with the Denver Writing Project here in Denver, Colorado. I work in nearby Aurora High School at Rangeview High School, or I work in nearby Aurora Public Schools at Rangeview High School, where I teach 11th grade English, and I also support teachers in a coaching capacity.
Cool. And you guys are getting on Youth Voices. Are you coming back? I hope so.
Yes, we're. Yeah, we'll talk through it right tonight, because there's sort of like we were kind of happily mired in the Crucible right before break, right? And I had some ideas that if this happened or that happened, I could integrate the Crucible into Youth Voices in some way. But we sort of like got really messy with the Crucible, and it was really fun, and it never made its way to the internet, which may or may not be, the internet might be better for that, actually. But it was
that's cool. Then what'd you do?
So
I didn't tell you were gonna I was gonna put you on a spot like this.
Oh no, that's right. Like what we did was we just I talked to them sort of about close reading and ways of approaching text. And so what we did was we started with watching sections of the movie, because we talked about how, our culture didn't identify the story as important based on reading the script. We identified it as important when people piled out of those theaters having watched the play and said, "Oh, this is."
I just saw it on Broadway recently, but yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So anywho, we watched sections of the movie, and then we would go from there to the script, and then from there we go sort of closer to scenes that we thought were really important to analyze. And so the idea is, just sort of this telescoping, or this, telescoping view of the text. So everybody always understood the story whenever we dove into the text. And then after we'd sort of done this close read, chunking the play that way, then we'd done some reading about feminism. And so then, then they had to write about what is their modern feminist lens. And so they had to talk about, who's the feminist that was, that informed their feminist lens on the Crucible. And so just in the last few days of their writing about it, I had a lot of students still asking me, where's that line? Where's that line about this? Where's that line about that? Cool. And I said, those lines any better than you all can. But thank God you're still asking me that question, because if you're asking me why we're still reading the Crucible, I'd be in trouble. So that's what we did.
But those essays could come up. Come on, we'd love to see those.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, you can post anything. So then the question as a teacher is, what do I want them to post, and why, and when?
Yeah, but those sound interesting. Ada, sorry I didn't know I was going to do that. But
no, that's
Joe and
great.
I haven't talked recently. But,
that sounds great.
So Ada, introduce yourself a little bit. How long did you teach, and what are you doing now?
So I was a teacher for 5 years. I taught 4th grade in a general ed classroom for 3, and then 6th grade social studies and math for 2 years. This was all in one K-8 school. Providence, Rhode Island now, because I came to Brown for my MAT program and found this position. And then the school was in Central Falls, which is just north of Providence. As Paul said, my 6th graders were on Youth Voices.
And you fell in love with Providence, right?
Yeah, I do love my life here. Coming from New York City, the smallness of it has connected with me.
And just to identify, Ada and I were neighbors in New York City, so yeah.
Yeah, still are neighbors. My parents live in the apartment where I grew up.
Yeah.
I knew I was ready for a transition from my old school, and was looking at different things, including some classroom positions, but found this opportunity, which was in my mind kind of like a sabbatical, where I got a 1-year internship at the Choices program. And the Choices program creates social studies curriculum for high schools predominantly, but some middle schools use their work too.
Ada, can I interrupt? Can you speak a little bit to that? You love teaching, but you also love thinking, right? Is that fair to say? Can you talk about trying to find that balance? Is that?
Yeah, I have not found it. I am trying to find it. So that verb tense works well. I loved being a student from the time I was 4, and there was a part of teaching I thought that didn't leave enough space for me to be a student of what I was doing. And teaching practice, I think that was in the particular situation I was in as a still relatively new teacher, a very, very demanding school, with a population that needed a lot and also offered a lot. But I was just felt like I was constantly doing. I poured my heart into it, as I think almost all good teachers do. And I didn't feel like I was getting the stimulation back that I do when I'm doing kind of big picture thinking and maybe a little more reading and writing. I would love
this quote unquote sabbatical, which really it isn't, it allowed you to do some of that thinking. Is that fair?
What did you say? Oh, this role now?
Yeah.
Definitely. I feel a lot more like the work I'm doing is kind of like, it is research. My role is described as the research and writing intern. But it also is thinking a lot about classrooms and teachers and how they're using what I'm producing. I definitely miss the relational aspect. I miss working with students and teachers directly. But this pause to do really deeper thinking, not so fast-paced, turning out things to use tomorrow or next week is really great. I also have time to think about what is the organization's function in the world and what do I critique about it, and I'm able to do some other work outside of it that I just have a kind of broader, I'm spreading myself for more things, and that feels nice.
Cool. So I'm going to share screen, and Joe, to interrupt, right? Whenever you'd like here. And just to show a little more about the Choices program, I mean, I'm not going to be talking, you are. Ada.
Yep.
And Joe, feel free to ask questions and let me know if I'm sharing this properly, because I have done broadcasts where, there it is. It is there, right?
Okay,
wait,
now I just
present to everyone. Yeah. Okay.
All right, so I don't know everything about this website, but...
Yeah, let me just start here. Yep. Okay, go ahead.
So, I mean, you can go to About.
It's the Choices program.
Yeah, the mission statement will be there, and I think some different links to curriculum. But I always go up to curriculum catalog because it shows the different series of curriculum that the program produces. And when it first started, it was mostly a policy, especially thinking a lot about the Cold War. It was founded in the 80s. Current Issues is now a really wide.
It focused on the Cold War at first? Wow.
Public policy in general, and it started with the Unit on the Cold War. I think the idea was we were in this really, dramatic time, and what public policymakers do are having huge impact. That has always been true and is true all over, but this was the mindset. We're starting it up, and since then, it's really broadened and developed a lot more historical curriculum, both world and U.S. based. And so if you go under curriculum catalog, you can click on those 3 different kind of strands.
What 3 strands?
Go up to curriculum catalog at the top, but without clicking.
I thought it was. Oh, okay, yeah. Sorry, yeah.
Don't click on, yeah, okay. So current issues are world issues and also local issues that are relatively current. Then there's the world history strand and the U.S. history strand. Geography is, I think, a developing one that just pulls on units from those other strands that have a heavy geography focus. All right,
so what you're going to just to identify quickly, and we will get there. What you're going to show us is something called In the News, right? Which is different than these things, but this is sort of the bread and butter of the organization. Is that right?
Yeah, I was going to say those are the curriculum series where a unit will be maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and we'll develop a full student, almost mini textbook, teacher resources that go in sequence for a whole unit. Those are sold as packages. News is a shorter. It's a free resource that we publish based on current events that come up that people in our program think are worthy of publishing something about. Maybe it's because it's underrepresented in the news and we want to highlight where it is being talked about. Maybe it's an issue that often comes with a lot of misconceptions. And so developing a curriculum that looks a little more critically at the context or the history behind the issue would bring out lesser told stories. Or it might just be a really big, hot issue that kids are probably trying to process and teachers could use some resources around.
And these are free, available on the web right here.
Right. Yep. So if you were to click on any one of those titles, you'd probably go to the page of the lesson, right? And so this is an interesting one. The Syrian comics lesson came up out of a unique collaboration between our program and I think a program based in London that creates comics around political issues, and comics in a serious sense, not a humorous version.
Yeah.
And so this here had access to some really, really rich, basically personal narratives that are told through comic. And we created a 1 or 2 day lesson around those and brought in content around the current situation in Syria. That current screenshot is showing is an overview text, and that comes in most teaching with the news lessons where there's a historical or maybe present day political background text that we write based on a lot of research, assuming that there isn't a good, maybe short enough text for kids at a certain reading level. And it gives a specific context for the rest of the work they'll do in the lesson.
Great.
Yeah. I don't know if you want to look at the one for Puerto Rico.
Yeah, we will. Sorry, I'll get back to that. But Joe, you have any questions as we start here?
I have to unmute myself. Let's see.
Yeah, there you are.
You know, I'm fascinated to hear about this project. So, I certainly don't want to jump in and make up a question that I don't have. I'm kind of curious, like that, as you talk about sort of like, Ada, as you talked about, like sometimes wanting to critique your organization and how its role in the world, or even sort of like, as you're talking about sort of free content versus what folks would want to purchase. I mean, sometimes I approach this stuff from a sort of a critical consumer perspective about like, what would my school really purchase and use? But I'm sort of curious about like, because what you're doing here is really, I mean, there's a lot of teachers and educators and people who think in the education space who say this is what is needed, right? Something happens in the world and then Twitter erupts with, if your kids aren't talking about this next week, you're not doing your job. And I'm sort of fascinated by that. And I'm fascinated by curriculum efforts that do thoughtful work around that. So I'm interested in just sort of like your critical thinking process and sort of like I guess some of the reflections you have and how you distinguish between, what's purchased content, what's free, and then even, like when do you produce something like that introductory text where you said there might not be something at an appropriate reading level, so we have to create new content. I guess I'm sort of interested in those things. That's a lot, but that's what I'm curious about. Yeah.
I mean, as to maybe one of the first questions you asked, I don't know how much I can speak to decisions around what's sold and what's not. I've just been in the organization for a few months, so I really don't know the discussions that go into that. But I think the organization exists as a nonprofit and needs to sustain itself. So there needs to be some selling. In terms of my own critical thinking about that, I have a lot of mixed feelings around just writing curriculum and making it a product. Because when I used to do it as a teacher, I was doing it for and through the relationships with my students and my colleagues, because that was the practice that we believed in and we had been hired to do. Now I'm creating a product, and a lot of the work that is surrounding it is not the interactions with my students around it, but how do we market it? And I'm not involved in that work because my job is more writing and creating. But that so much of the organization's energy has to be on how do we make the product, and isn't necessarily as in touch with who is using it and what are their experiences of it and how do they fit that into their own story of themselves. I miss the questions I just said. I miss the creating something because I know the people I'm using it with and we're going to grow together through it. That's just not the role I'm in right now. However, I really see the value of creating curriculum outside of the pressure of a teaching role. The quality control is just enormous because we're creating a product and we're held accountable in a lot of ways. We're not just teaching it tomorrow, and we're going to do whatever we have ready by tomorrow morning at 8. I do so much research to create the materials that I create. And I did that, a lot while I was teaching, but I didn't always have time or capacity to make sure every single lesson I created was thoroughly researched. And so sometimes that meant it was, just shorter or skimpier, or maybe just not as rich as it could have been. So the ability to just focus on the creation process and not be rushed by implementing it also has its benefits, I guess.
Before we started recording, you and I were talking about how the Choices program is also going online with their materials, which creates another set of ethical issues and so forth and so forth. But I think what you just said is really clear. Joe is at a writing project, and I'm at a writing project, and it's interesting to think about all of the materials that we've produced over the years and that are available online, and how do we, the National Writing Project is a nonprofit too. So how do we all stay alive? Is a good question, right? Given all this material we produced, but. Anyway,
right, and I also have questions about to stay alive. Teachers need to lean on other resources. I can't imagine it's possible to create single thing from scratch. The way that right now what I'm creating is mostly always from scratch, or using found resources. But we're conceiving of and creating our materials. Teachers need to lean on, and I believe, and I'm sure you do too, and do this too, in leaning on what other teachers are making. I wish there were more communities that were, focused or easier to plug into or something. I'm not sure what it would take, where teachers are sharing. So I create something because I have a week where I can and I really want to, and then someone can use that 2 weeks later. And 2 weeks later, I can use something they made 2 weeks ago. As opposed to there needing to be nonprofit organizations that make things. But I bet there'd be pushback on still limitations of that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, these are all important issues. And when you start with the student's perspective, they ought to be able to get to any rich material that they want to, right? And so, yeah. Anyway, but I think we can imagine all those big questions. What we are going to look at, and we're finally going to get there, is free and available online. Is that correct? The Puerto Rico stuff.
Yep.
Okay, and I will get back to that. I think I put you on here. There we go. So let's just look through that material. I think you said when I invited you here, you said that you were the main writer on this stuff. Is that? Are you sticking with that?
No,
okay.
I did. Okay. I did write all of these materials. We are a very collaborative team. But sometimes with teaching with the news, it's a small or manageable enough project that one person can really take the lead in. So my colleagues offered feedback in multiple rounds, but I had the initial idea. I did the research and then wrote these materials.
Okay. So, do you mind reading some of it to us, and we'll look at it? And Joe, this would be a great time for you to give feedback on what you see in here. Is this a good place to start?
With this? This is the page with a bunch of lessons, and the featured lesson is always the most recent. So this is the most recent Teaching with the News lesson we published. If you click Learn More, you'll get to the lesson page, and there's a key question in the title usually. And so this, I had the idea of, okay, we're always monitoring what's in the news, what might be a Teaching with the News lesson. And I had the idea during a month when not a lot of people were saying, oh, I have an idea of a Teaching with the News lesson, that, wow, Puerto Rico's been in the news for some time. We haven't created a lesson around it. And it's in the news for some time because it's a pretty serious situation. And the fact that it's lasting so long is a question for students to be grappling with, and obviously adults too. And so that's where the question came up. In my mind, it was, why is this maybe lasting so much longer than the recovery after Hurricane Harvey?
And it's still going on. And if you look at the deaths, that's amazing. I don't know if that's in your curriculum, but
there's a line that says,
Go ahead.
There's a line in the overview reading that says something like, while the statistics really vary, there are a lot of deaths, and that kind of controversy over who's counting and how came out a little bit after we published. But so if you scroll down,
It does let me ask a hard question as we're getting into this, but does choices suggest that there are different points of view on different topics? Is there a political perspective, do you think, of the choices program? Having been there now, what, 4 months?
That's a great question, and it's one that we talk about a lot in the writer's room. There always is, anywhere with any humans, and whether it's acknowledged or formally written or said somewhere is a different question. Doesn't publish, we take this political stand on this issue. And the question of how do you present multiple perspectives is a hard one. I would definitely say among the people I work with, there's a strong stance around teaching history or current events too as a political act. We all believe that our world needs to be more just. And the ways that we're going to go about creating curriculum about history and current events is going to be bent towards, justice in the sense of democratizing whose voices are presented, who's positioned as knowledgeable and having agency. Those questions, talking about power, those questions we're always, share as priorities. But I wouldn't say the Choices program has published anything that says it's political stances.
I think that's pretty clear. Yeah. So, you built this?
I didn't do that. Do you mean the online?
Yeah,
portrayal of it? No, we have a person who's in charge of putting everything up online. I created everything in Google Docs, basically, and then link her to them. But yeah, I did create all the text.
Okay.
And so this is one long lesson plan, but it's interspersed with these links. And so the objectives are up at the top, and then the handouts are sources that I created that I thought teachers and students would need in order to do the thinking of the lesson. And the first one is going to be that overview text that I told you about. And
why don't you say what the 3 objectives are, though? That's worth saying. Yeah.
Yep. So students will understand the post-hurricane situation in Puerto Rico within a broader context of U.S. Puerto Rican relations. That was me and then my colleagues agreeing to take a historical context approach to the lesson. Sometimes lessons in current events don't do that, but examine what's happening now. Let's understand how what's happening is connected to a historical story that's often not taught about in schools.
Go ahead, Jeff.
And then,
Oh, thanks, Ada. Sorry to interrupt. I guess my question, right, related to the question about I'm fascinated by the concept of rejecting neutrality as a teacher, right? The idea that we don't have to be neutral to be teachers, and the notion of a political, that teaching is a political act, and I think that's important. And I'm kind of curious, as you're doing this work at this time in our country, right? It's kind of interesting to me, just because, you seem like you're clearly taking a very thoughtful approach to this stuff, and you're just this question of who is responsible, and the idea that as you dig in, to Puerto Rico's, as a U.S. territory and things like that, and the responsibility of our government, and the idea that you'd be creating curriculum and at a time when, there's just a lot of just plain evidence that that a lot of governmental positions haven't been filled, and our government's sending a message that we don't care about this place. And I just think it just seems like any notion of, because the original question kind of sounds like, oh, there's multiple choices about who might be responsible. But ultimately, Puerto Rico, the U.S. government has some responsibility here for this. And just the idea that are you coming up against just not writing what the heck is happening with this world, or what is happening currently? Because it just seems like the headline, you have to tone so much of that down in the creation of these, would be my guess. So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I'll speak as an individual teacher and writer, not on behalf of Choices. And I did grapple with that all the time. I did as a teacher too, where I had to tone down what I wanted students to understand and think. It's so hard, especially within the framework of multiple perspectives, and facilitating students and doing the work of corroborating sources and genuinely looking into different perspectives those are valuable skills, and those are needed if we're going to have what I even believe as a certain just world. But I would never let that excuse like this artificial, I guess I'm not sure why it's artificial in my mind, but presenting seemingly balanced perspectives, not acknowledging who has power, which perspectives are always, the ones we hear, which ones are doing a lot of destruction in the world. So if you look at the sources that students eventually examine in this lesson, there's one with some really racist and obnoxious tweets from the president, and the rest, maybe pretty much all, call out the U.S. government as being historically and presently responsible for a lot of what's going on. So there's no way you could say this is a balanced debate, but my intention wasn't to do that. And there's a nice article by a teacher named Jonathan Gold, who writes for Teaching Tolerance, and he's a teacher here in Providence at the Moses Brown School. And he wrote, maybe a couple months ago, a piece called, like, what are we doing when we teach multiple perspectives? And he makes the case, the key thing, and I believe this is to be transparent with your students. I would never tell them I'm being neutral when I'm not. And when I'm presenting perspectives, I'll say, I collected these for you. I chose which ones are here, and I chose not to put some ones in this set today. And I hope you go off and explore the ones you feel like aren't here. But I hope that we get to some understandings together. I hope you challenge my understanding of what I'm saying. But we have a job to present perspectives that are not often heard or that are marginalized so that we can change U.S. power in the world. And those questions, as long as I name that I'm doing them from a biased place, I think are important to raise. That being said,
shall we look at the? Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah. Shall we look at the resources then? Does that make sense?
Then, yeah. If you scroll
I interrupted you though. What were you going to say?
That being said, I really do believe in the act of listening to different perspectives, because even within what I think of as my vision for what a more just world would be, or what critical thinking kids should be doing or landing at, there is so much diversity within that. And I would never say that to like move away from the horrible world we live in now, there is one way to see and to go. So I do believe in asking questions that are genuinely open and not trying to get students to land at one understanding that I also have. But I do about the kind of pressure sometimes to tone down by having this, like, let's all be okay and deliberating among perspectives. That
yeah. Well, the background picture here is not a picture of Trump throwing paper towels, right? But
every choice.
But maybe that would be a cheap shot, though. I don't know.
Yeah. It's a little stressful sometimes. Every choice when you're presenting something that someone across the country could use versus just your class of 20 or 40 students.
Yeah.
Every choice is one that you're kind of responsible for. But I would never. But again, like I said, I would never claim that I was choosing that photo or, the sources from any kind of neutral perspective. I would hope that the objectives that I named at the top are being reached by all of my choices, and I would stand behind those objectives, I guess.
But we could really think about this photograph. It's an interesting photograph. There are people helping themselves, and yet it's a government helicopter. There's plenty we could look at here. Yeah. So I think the second objective here is pretty. We've just been talking about comparing perspectives. Yes. Yeah. And then this is what your goal is: to form and justify their opinions about the responsibility of Puerto Rico's recovery.
I guess
after hurricane.
But not to finalize their opinions, because I don't think there are enough sources in the lesson. But based on, if you go on to the comparing sources handout at the bottom, there are prompts that have students respond to the sources that they looked at. Sorry, not all the way at the bottom of those handouts. The fourth one is called comparing sources, and that students are invited to use when they read the 6 or 8 sources that they get into. So what do you think after reading these?
So this is a piece of writing they're doing?
Yep.
Okay.
And then there are always extended.
They're going to publish it on Youth Voices, right? That's great.
They could, I guess. The teachers who use it. are plugged in.
Well, I am curious to ask. Go ahead. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, these lessons often have slightly more closed tasks for students to do than I might have when I was presented when I was teaching, because they're just one-offs. And I don't know actually the history of these sources is that it's often some basic comprehension work, some inference work, or connecting work, but there's not usually a what do you make of it? It's a lot more scaffolding than sometimes I would provide. Which I think is helpful when teachers are looking to another source for materials.
Right. I mean, and they can pick and choose what they use.
Right, and there's so many options to launch off of this. I imagine some teachers might take some of this and then 2 weeks later continue with a more open-ended prompt.
Does it make sense to look at the sources at this point?
Sure.
Does that sound okay?
Yeah, the way that we generally choose sources, if there's a comparing sources task, is just reading a lot of current events. And so throughout November, I was reading all different sources. I was doing Google searches every couple of days to see what came up. And then often, one source would link to or mention another, and I'd go chase that. Ones that I thought collected different agents, people or government groups or the government that could be claimed as responsible for what comes next in Puerto Rico.
So there's United Nations.
Yeah, human rights experts. And I haven't looked at these in a little while, but
it's okay.
Yeah, then there are a lot of interviews with the governor. So this was just one, and perhaps there were two there.
And you excerpted things. So,
yeah. Because this is supposed to be for a 1 day, maybe 2-day lesson, we have to cut down a lot of the sources.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how long does this take? You're saying we can do all this in 2 days? Whoa.
Yeah. These materials could be used in 2 days, and then I would hope, or I guess the program would hope too, that teachers expand in their own ways beyond it, if they have time. That's the thing, is from the teacher feedback we do get, the main thread that kind of makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable is how little time teachers have to do what they would like to do with their classes.
Yeah. I like the variety here. Sorry, were you saying something
that no teacher would pick up that doesn't fit? Sorry.
Go ahead. I think there might be a bit of a delay.
I'm aware that there might be some teachers who can't even glance or click on these links because they don't have time in their AP course to. That's just the reality. That's frustrating.
Yeah. I should say that one of the contexts that I put in the invitation for tonight's show is that a lot of us are pulling together material around this PBS video that is coming out at the end of February called The American Creed. And even to think, I mean, for some people, unfortunately, to think that people in Puerto Rico are Americans is a really important concept. So there's a lot of writing and thinking about, Americans. So I love that we have this resource for thinking about, who is America? What is America? What are the values of Americans? And in the context of Puerto Rico and the hurricane, I think it's a really interesting addition to that film that is coming out. But so just to get through here quickly, though, this is a reporter and NPR reporter. Yeah.
Yes.
And can I go listen?
Right. So
if I follow this link, I can go listen to it too? Yeah.
And you can listen to it or look at the transcription. And that one was a NPR reporter because he was, through his reporting, calling on the voices of a lot of, people in the town or the city where he was. I'm not sure if it was San Juan. And it was really hard to, either video, audio, or written material from people who are living this catastrophe. So you had to kind of rely on the reporting of other organizations. This was a great movie. Democracy Now! Has a lot of source material that I like to use for these teaching with the news lessons. It was a video that...
Your political bias is showing, but I appreciate it. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think the reporter created it as a montage, but the narrator and the voices in the in the video are all residents of a certain neighborhood in Rio Pedras, or maybe that's the name of the neighborhood. And their words are powerful. And there's also a video that students can watch if they want.
Huh?
That was a great.
Back over here.
Great
and it does, yeah. I mean, right. It starts right up at that point in the story. Is that right? Yeah. Cool.
And it tells, like, gives a perspective that often is not one that comes out in big questions about government and big political issues, which is that we are people who, we actually know our own needs and our own visions more than anyone else does. And so, yeah, we need resources, and we've historically been denied a lot of rights and resources, but we also have a role to play in the recovery. We don't just need, the help from afar.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then what is this?
These are a letter from Democratic senators.
Okay.
Writing to the administrator, I think, of FEMA. Yep. Saying, approving federal funds that would have been equivalent to the funds that any U.S. state got. It took a long time for that to happen. Mm-hmm. These are tweets in which President Trump, says the mayor and the people of Puerto Rico need to do more work.
Right.
Some of these sources are in conversation with each other directly, so we'll, refer to each other. I like when that happens. And this was a public letter that the mayor of San Juan published.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start. Let's get some quick feedback on this, Joe, if you don't mind too. I mean, and I'll start by saying I like the different perspectives that are here. One of the writing things that I love to do is a dialogue of authors, where kids actually write. So I can imagine doing your sheet and then having them actually, have the mayor talk to the governor, talk to Trump, actually have them talking back and forth to each other as a sort of drama. But yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate both that these are excerpts and you can kind of get through them quickly, which I think is important. And then an L student could also deal with this because it's not so long. I think.
Yeah, that's a challenge.
Joe, you have any thoughts?
That same piece, the idea that the size of the materials is appropriate for the time frame you've presented. I mean, in terms of 2 days, when Paul says whoa, I think you could very easily see this 2 days being 5. At the same time, is particularly in terms of like the teacher feedback that might come in terms of like some of the graphic organizers you've included and how long do those take, to get the type of student work you're hoping for and to demonstrate and things like that. Right. So this is obviously, I like this specific resource just because it's very, prompts critical thinking. It's sort of, I like it in its simplicity, but then I also appreciate, as Paul was, your links to the
it could expand
resources. The idea that somebody, a student who's cruising through these materials and reading quickly and finishing fast can, go on a deeper dive, or that all this stuff can turn into, a good extension activity that I like, which is, okay, what are some search terms if you had to know more, or if you had to research more, and what can you find online that would be an appropriate credible addition to this? That's what I like about it is, how you've chunked it, stayed true to the original resources.
At the very bottom of each lesson plan, so if you are on the main lesson page, you're scrolling all the way down, there's a heading called Extra Challenges, which are just a few proposed, points of extension. Obviously, teachers can create their own. I love the idea of posing a question or even just a current issue and having students do the collecting work if they have access to the internet, which they almost always do now, and creating a set of sources and justifying why they chose their sources. So sometimes letting kids be the curators of, or students be the curators of, those different perspectives in the news. That's sometimes an extra challenge too.
Yeah, but it's also, but I don't think when we do that, I also like doing that, but when we do that, we don't get the variety of voices that you've captured here. So I think being able to point to this and say, what kinds of different, perspectives did we gather? When you go out and gather more, make sure you're, getting the different kinds also.
Having the models
the models are important.
Yeah, sure. And also something I'm hearing you both say, which is making me realize this, is multiple perspectives does not have to be like equidistant political perspectives, meaning equidistant from each other, where there's like someone radically left, someone radically right, and then 1 inch along the spectrum will land someone else. I think variety of perspectives can be roles in the world, genders, races, and locality versus far away. And so that there does seem to be diversity in these sources, and that even if, politically maybe there's more.
Whether you're a policy person or a town person, still have the same political point of view, but you're having a different perspective. Yeah, interesting. I did want to make sure we looked at. It's slowing down. Okay, we're good though. Looked at these two. This is the introduction. I mean, you're imagining the students would read this first, or at some point?
So you read it first, and then the corresponding kind of comprehension questions are often optional. If teachers feel like they want to spend a day really digging into the text and making sure students get it, especially if they're younger or reading is harder, that's an option. But the corresponding questions are mostly just literal comprehension. And the reason to have the text, whatever teachers do with it, is that's going to fill in what a lot of the news isn't, or it's going to provide a bigger context than what is in the news. This goes back 100 years in terms of its historical scope.
And you wrote this?
Yeah.
Or who writes these? Yeah.
I wrote this. Yeah.
That's fun.
Yeah.
And it's something you wouldn't be able to do if you were the teacher, right?
No, I'd be taking something I found from somewhere else and cutting it up in certain ways and then printing it. That's my job as the research and writing intern, is to do a really in-depth research and writing process. So all of the curriculum material I create, including for the bigger units, is, I'll take tons and tons of books out of the library and do a lot of online perusing, and I'll take copious notes and then from that try to synthesize into a couple of paragraphs or pages what I think is key. And that's the hardest part. I also am developing my own understanding of historical and current issues so much more deeply than I did before, because to have to write is the best way to make sure you understand something. And then to have to write to 9th graders it requires an even, I think, more complicated level of synthesizing. So that's what this text came from.
Wouldn't it be great if you could teach in the morning and then do the writing in the afternoon, right?
Or 1 week off, 1 week on, or every other day. Yeah, I think about that all the time.
Yeah, interesting. I just wanted to point out that I don't know if we ever talked about hypothesis before, but hypothesis would be an interesting way to go in here and have students find something that they think is important or interesting and then annotate it, right? And then that would exist on that page for anybody else who's using hypothesis. I'm not logged in right now, but anyway, it'd be a nice document to do that with, it seems. And then this is sort of questions about that document.
Right, and these are, I guess actually the last one is more of students' opinion, but mostly this is just to make sure that students understood important points in the text, if teachers want to use it.
Cool.
But the bulk of the work is the synthesis with the sources.
So now, what are these materials?
Okay, so this is what's called the lesson plan, where it's basically it's instructions to the teacher on how to use my vision of a sequence of 2 lessons, maybe. Now, it doesn't say where the first lesson ends, because I know teachers have totally different time blocks, but my idea of how you'd progress through the resources, always leading to some culminating discussion about the key ideas. Basically, it's talking in second person to the teacher. including some questions verbatim that they could pose to the class. And sometimes there are different options along the way. Like you might choose to have students, you might choose to have students respond to those questions about the background reading, or you might have them watch the video or not, I think this comes from my own experience teaching. The most important part, other than making sure the resources are rich, is that last section, which is either 4 or 5, closing discussion. What are you leaving students with, and what are the meaty questions that they're pulling together all of their material to answer? And you wrote all this too, right? Yeah. Good. Yeah. I love that. One of my favorite parts of teaching across subjects, math, social studies, was read alouds, was writing questions, posing questions. So what do you mean? That's fun. You're writing the questions? Yeah. I love creating questions that I'm going to ask students in discussion. And of course, more come up on the spot and students ask them too. But like really thinking about what probing questions are and how to sequence questions to lead to understandings. I love that part of teaching. Mm-hmm. Where are the questions here? Do you mind reading through this section? Yeah, so this is assuming students have been out at work and are coming back to maybe a rug area or some central place. Invite students to share their responses to the third question on the comparing sources handout. So this is one of the more synthesis questions. Okay, let's says who should be responsible for look back at it. Wait, it's this question. Wait, where is it? This one? No, but I think it was the third one. Yeah, according to each source, who is responsible? And this is a so what did the sources say about this question? And then that's my idea of sequencing questions. I'm not going to start out. I didn't start out the concluding discussion with so who's responsible in your view, but just to call on kids to pull from the resources first. Okay, sorry. Go back to this. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Where were you? Yeah, and so then the next paragraph says, ask students to refer to the reading from earlier in the lesson. So that's drawing in the historical background reading to make connections between the perspectives they just kind of reiterated from the sources and bigger historical perspectives that maybe the sources weren't talking about or mentioned in 3 words. I think that's key, is to make sure that links happen across the sources you throw at students, and it's the teacher's job to make sure that happens. How do different claims about responsibility for Puerto Rico's recovery connect to what students know about Puerto Rico's status as a U.S. territory? Then I talk about some examples of how funding connects, how voting power or lack of voting power connects. Then go on to a question of how did any sources that students read directly talk about the historical and political relationship between Puerto Rico and the U.S.? Then what do you believe as students about who's responsible for ensuring Puerto Rico is able to rebuild? And I always have 5 paragraphs of questions and have to cut them down. Well, I mean, a teacher could choose, right? That's true. And then the extra challenges are possible extensions. Kids could do them for extra credit at home. They could do it in class the next day if they had time. I think I like some of these. Invite students to research more about Puerto Rico's history. I assume that not a lot of students are researching about Puerto Rico's history in class, but maybe that's not true. If students have connections to members of the Puerto Rican community living in the United States, invite them to interview those individuals about their perspectives on Puerto Rico's relationship with the U.S. There's a 3-week project. That's cool. Or a week. Yeah, I think that's nice. Yeah. There's also that prompt brings up something that comes up a lot for me, which is who is using these materials. If I'm teaching tomorrow, I know the human beings deeply who's using, and the teachers who are using them. And here I don't know all the students who are using choice materials, but I'm not sure how many of them have connections to members of the Puerto Rican community and how many do, who does and who doesn't. And I don't know that. Which again, having that week off, week on, you would have that connection, right? But yeah. Interesting. And then the last challenge is looking at a bunch of different hurricanes or other natural disasters that have happened in the U.S. and doing some compare contrast work if you can find data to compare and contrast on government response. Wow, that's heavy. I mean, they would have to more or less do the same kind of 2 or 3 days on each of the other ones, I guess, or
Yeah.
or more.
But yeah, these are great. Yeah. I mean, they're good in that you can see how it could develop from here. Cool. I mean, I think we've looked at it, right? Is there anything else that we missed?
Nope. That's it.
Yeah. Joe, any thoughts, questions that we've... let me try to, here. I'm going to try to unshare this and then we can talk just a little bit more. There we are, we're back. So let me ask you, Ada, what's that feel like to have shared that with us? What are you thinking now? Yeah.
I liked hearing the few moments when you both gave your feedback because it helped me think about not just even some things that could be different, but a lot of things that were great about it that I hadn't tuned into. It was a little bit more of me. I felt in my brain like I had to justify what was there more than I think you were asking, and I don't know where that comes from, but I think just needs to happen more. Where, in my experience at least, teachers are sharing things with each other, so it's not they're not presenting or performing it. You're just talking through it. I don't think I did not do that as a teacher very much at all.
Didn't do what?
Can you guys hear me? Oh,
yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead, Joe. We can hear you. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I guess I think what strikes me about it, just, my sort of general response is a little bit of what I said earlier, just the idea that like there's this notion, I think, that's been popularized by social media that like, and I'm sure there's always been pressure to teach about the current events in the classroom, right? But I think particularly in these in our charged political climate, there's teachers will hear the message over and over, Charleston just happened, you should be teaching about Charleston, or you're not doing your sort of due diligence.
Charlottesville,
sorry. Yeah, excuse me.
It's okay.
So
just what happened?
Yeah, no, there's no new news. But the notion that for teachers can be, it can be a weighty thing to be saying, and the notion of how to unpack that, I think is, that's a question that surely has to be on teachers' minds. And I think that some of that is social media, some of that is the internet, and some of that is the charged political climate. And so it just seems like, as we think about the evolution of sort of text-based materials to use for teaching, I think what I really appreciate is the polished nature of these materials that would help teachers teach in response to some of those calls, and probably also teach in response to maybe their own urging to do something, but not to do it in a way that looks like they're coming up with with something on the fly that administrators or their peers might not see as polished. But surely a 5-year-old textbook will not support students in grappling with this very issue. And so I just appreciate sort of where this potentially fits in sort of the evolutionary chain with curriculum and sort of in response to today's events.
That's a really good point, that it particularly was, especially if it happened last week, there's less material source out there. And so it's more likely that you're going to do a not as deep job or have a lot more work to do from scratch just to create those materials. And so for this to be a little more thoughtfully done over time, because I had the time to do it, is maybe less like what materials about this stuff usually looks like.
Yeah, I mean, a couple comments I have or thoughts I've had as we were looking at this is that I keep wanting to ask, what are they making? And that conversation at the end on the carpet is sort of where you wanted it to end, and I wanted to end with publishing on Youth Voices, but it's not. I'm not just promoting Youth Voices there. It's more about like, what are you going to make now that you know this, right? What can you put out there in the world that's important to you? So there's that. And then I'm also always interested in thinking about a classroom where everybody's not necessarily doing the same thing. So that could somebody come to this page on the website, a kid, and you help them find where they get the resources. You could print them out and give them to them. So it seems to me like a small group could work on Puerto Rico if they got interested in it, if that was their question, right? So thinking about these materials that way, I think is interesting. So that.
But what you're describing is like, you know, inquiry curriculum, right?
Right. Or curriculum that fits into an inquiry.
And teaching with the news lessons fit into an inquiry model.
I think they do too. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Oh, I was going to ask, did you hear the here's an extension, the on the media hour-long broadcast about Puerto Rico?
You
got to listen to that.
Yeah.
It must have been there was that they had a reporter. She's actually a producer for On the Media, and she spent 4 weeks there. Recording again, getting different perspectives. It's amazing. It's really quite wonderful. And then Latino USA just did this week. I think it was this week. Never know when I get a podcast, you know. But did a whole section about looking into the death toll, and you know, we know it's not 16, but from a math perspective, and I know you are interested in math, from a math perspective, it's really interesting to think about how they do the calculations that get to the 1,000 people died, you know, since the hurricane. So, and why those numbers are important. Anyway, those two sources, I think,
those
are great. Yeah, are really interesting.
A lot of teaching with the news lessons, just to go back to the choices materials for a second, include a resource that's called something like Following the Issue, some other term for that concept. And it prompts students to keep track of the issue for weeks or months after the lesson as a way to keep it current. And they might find a podcast.
And you know, the fact that this is still in the news is the news, right? I mean, the fact that the other hurricanes have come and gone and people are recovering, and you know, it's different in Puerto Rico for some reason, right? And so But,
and that's what I felt was part of the issue when I wrote it, because it was, oh my gosh, it's a month later, and now it's the same thing months later.
Right. Cool. Well, thank you for expanding our world here and including these materials. Joe, you have any final thoughts? And then Ada can have the last word.
In terms of my closing thoughts, let's see. I just really appreciate, you know, these issues being in a space where they're accessible for teachers. I think, you know, having skimmed them or having had them flashed in front of me myself, I think it's powerful that this project is going on. And I really appreciate, you know, the way you're reflecting on your own teaching and your desire as a teacher to sort of go deeper, prepare things always better. And I just appreciate like that tension as you shared, like the creation of these materials. And I think that, you know, I suspect that there's any number of textbook writing projects that maybe didn't have that level of like heart to them nor responsiveness. So I just appreciate that.
Cool. Thanks, Ada.
Yeah, thank you. That's a nice final comment. I just appreciate that note about that the heart and the passion for it, that comes through even if you're not in relationship with the students using it. And that's something I'm grappling with right now. So it's kind of good to reflect back on that's still there.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah,
and we'll talk to you again soon.
Okay. Good night.
Thanks, Joe.
Good night. Sure.
Good night.